Have you guys ever seen the movie Inception? So it's this crazy story about a thief who has the ability to enter people's dreams and steal their secrets from their subconscious. And in the process of the movie, this guy is going through a dream within a dream within a dream. It goes like five levels deep. And I remember as I was watching it, at one point I was like, wait, what level are we on right now? Can someone please draw me a chart? Which is kind of funny because nowadays there are all kinds of charts online that map out the dream levels in this movie. So obviously I'm not the only one who had trouble keeping track of the levels. So the reason I bring that up is because I'm currently in the middle of a slow motion debate with a Hebrew roots teacher named David Wilbur, and it's starting to feel like the movie Inception. What level are we at? I mean, I watched his latest response, which would be part 4 in our discussion, and at one point, he was quoting from me, quoting from him, quoting from me, I think. Anyway, I'll link to parts 1 through 4 below in case you're a glutton for punishment and you want to retrace the whole conversation. And as I've mentioned previously, I've invited David twice to come on this channel and discuss these things live and in person, but he declined both times. So hopefully we'll get a chance to have a live public discussion at some point. So today, rather than adding another level to the confusion about who said what, when, I want to take a step back and sort of reset the discussion. Because what I realized when I was watching David's response in part 4 is that the reason he claims that I moved the goalposts in my argument, and the reason that he continually mischaracterizes my position, is that he doesn't understand it. He completely misunderstood my original teaching. And as a professor, a teacher, that's on me. I have to do a better job. And for that reason, David, I owe you a debt of gratitude for challenging me. Iron sharpens iron, right? Because I know that if you misunderstood my original teaching, that means there are probably others out there who misunderstood it as well. And so by challenging me, you've given me the opportunity to improve and to restate what I believe the Bible teaches with more clarity and precision. So thank you, because this is very important for the body of Christ to understand. There are so many people out there, I hear from them every day, who are currently dealing with, or thankfully working their way out of, the bondage of thinking that they're required to keep the old covenant laws, like eating kosher and keeping the 7th-day Shabbat and keeping the Torah feasts and so on. As I always say, those traditions are permitted for followers of Jesus, but they're not required. So it's important that we understand the freedom we have in Christ and why we cannot follow the law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus at the same time. And today we're going to take a new and improved look at 5 reasons why. Now, David accused me of moving the goalposts, which means changing the rules or the claims in the middle of an argument in an attempt to win. And that's a big deal to me because I'm not trying to win an argument here. My goal is to put myself under the authority of Scripture and prayerfully do my best to work out what it teaches. But I'm far from perfect and I don't get everything right. So if I'm guilty of moving the goalposts, I want to know about it. I want to be corrected. Because again, for me, it's not about winning an argument. It's about seeking the truth of Scripture. And after watching David's response in part 4 twice, I honestly don't see where the goalposts moved. I think maybe what happened is that David misunderstood my argument and added a goalpost of his own. But if you disagree, please let me know what you see. Okay, on to far more important things. Let's take a look at 5 reasons why we can't follow the law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus at the same time. And I'm going to be introducing some new information here to further clarify and articulate what the Bible teaches on these points. And since a visual chart is really helpful when mapping out the dream levels in the movie Inception, I'm going to go to the chalkboard because I think that'll also be really helpful to map out these 5 reasons for us. Okay, let's start by talking about the priesthood. And I'll draw a box here, and I'll put priests in here. So in the Torah, the role of the priesthood was to facilitate the offerings and sacrifices and other temple services involved in the worship of Yahweh. And the Torah explicitly commands that every priest must be an Israelite from the tribe of Levi. That's why it's called the Levitical priesthood. So we can think about the priestly regulations given in the law as the border of this box, right? Imagine everything required under Moses is contained within this box. So let's add the word Levi, because only the Levites were allowed to be priests, right? So if you were from the tribe of Judah, you were not allowed in, right? And if you're from the tribe of Benjamin, you are not allowed in, right? And if you're a Gentile, you are certainly not allowed in, right? So these were the regulations that Yahweh gave under the Old Covenant. And if the law of Moses is still in effect today, then this priesthood is still required. It's not optional, it's required. But if that's the case, then on what basis does the New Testament tell us that every believer in Jesus, whether or not they're an Israelite, is a priest and has been given priestly duties? 1 Peter 2:5 says, all followers of Jesus are, quote, a holy priesthood offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And the book of Revelation 3 times says that Jesus has made us priests of God. And Romans 12:1 says, we are to, quote, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. That's priestly language, right? The priestly duties of making sacrifices that are pleasing to God are now the domain of every believer in Jesus, whether Jew or Gentile or Levite. And that's not all. The Bible also explicitly tells us that Jesus is now our high priest, even though he descended from the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Levi. So the New Testament reveals that these priestly regulations are no longer required. Now, anyone who believes in Jesus is a priest of God, whether they're from the tribe of Levi or Judah or Benjamin or a Gentile, right? It no longer matters. All believers in Jesus are priests and have been given priestly duties, right? And most Hebrew roots teachers will readily acknowledge this. So what we're talking about here is mutually exclusive priesthoods. So if you want to follow the Old Covenant law, then you need to keep these priestly regulations, right? Then Gentiles and Jews from other tribes cannot be priests. But if we want to follow the gospel of Jesus, then these priestly regulations are no longer required. They've served their God-ordained purpose and are no longer in effect. We can't have it both ways. Are the Levitical regulations required or not required, right? It's a either-or question. So in categories of logic, this is called the law of non-contradiction, which states that two contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. It's often put like this. So X, so an idea we'll call generically X not equal to non-X, right? So X and non-X cannot be true at the same time and in the same sense. God's priesthood cannot be restricted to Levites and open to non-Levites at the same time. So on the issue of the priesthood, the question for our Hebrew roots friends is this: who are you going to follow? The law of Moses, under which the priesthood is limited to only Levites? Or the gospel of Jesus, under which all believers are priests? We can't follow both at the same time. Now, there are two arguments you might hear from our Torah-observant friends. Some claim that the apostles attended temple services in the New Testament, thereby acknowledging the ongoing validity of the Levitical priesthood. But of course, the point isn't whether the Levitical priesthood was operational, it's whether it was required. The Levitical priesthood was never prohibited. So the question is this: is the Levitical restriction for the priesthood given under the Old Covenant still required under the New Covenant? And the answer is no, it's not. Anyone who comes to faith in Jesus is a priest. They don't need to be a Levite. That's what's changed. And don't forget that the first century temple was not operating as a Christian institution, but as a Jewish one. So in the New Testament, we have a whole bunch of Jewish apostles and disciples who had attended temple services their entire lives, and those services were never forbidden. So we would fully expect them to keep attending temple if they wanted, they would have no reason to stop. And actually, most of the time in the New Testament, when we see the apostles visiting the temple or synagogue, it was to share the gospel of Jesus with their Jewish brothers and sisters. Now, the other argument you might hear is that under the Old Covenant, all believers were also identified as priests. And those who make this argument will point to Exodus 19:6, where Yahweh says to Israel, "You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Now, does this phrase, kingdom of priests, indicate that every Israelite is in fact a priest who has been given priestly duties in the same way that were priests under the New Covenant? Or is it instead identifying that the nation of Israel as a whole is to serve in a priestly role among the nations as an intermediary between the peoples and God? Now, I take the latter interpretation, but when it comes to the issue of the Levitical priesthood that we've been discussing, it doesn't really matter how you understand this phrase, because the Torah very clearly establishes a Levitical regulation for God's priests. Deuteronomy 18:5 says this about the Levites: "For the Lord your God has chosen them and their descendants out of all your tribes to stand and minister in the Lord's name always." So the Torah unambiguously commands that every priest must be an Israelite from the tribe of Levi. And God's priesthood cannot be restricted to Levites and open to non-Levites at the same time, right? Which means we need to choose whether we're going to follow the law of Moses or the gospel of Jesus, because we can't follow both at the same time on this issue. All right, next up is the temple, and we'll draw another box here. Temple. And again, now imagine everything required under Moses is contained within this box, right? And what God required is a physical sanctuary, which in the Torah was a portable tabernacle for the wandering Israelites. But about 400 years later, Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem, which then became the permanent sanctuary for the Israelites. So there are a dozen chapters in Exodus dedicated to the tabernacle and God's intricate and beautiful instructions for the table of bread and the golden lampstand and the bronze altar and the outer court and so on. And of course, the temple is where God was to be worshiped. So I'll add worship here. And this is where the sacrifices were required to be made. All right. And the Torah also commanded that the feasts and festivals were to be observed at the temple, especially the three pilgrimage festivals, which are Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Exodus 23 commands that 3 times every year, all the male Israelites were to appear before the Lord, which means at the tabernacle or later at the temple in Jerusalem. So, if the law of Moses is still in effect today, then God requires a temple today, right? And of course, God allowed the temple to be destroyed almost 2,000 years ago, just as Jesus prophesied. More importantly, though, if the temple was still required, then why does the New Testament tell us that believers in Jesus are now God's temple? 1 Corinthians 3, verses 16 and 17 says, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple." So the whole idea behind the temple is a sacred space where the Spirit of God dwells among his people. And the New Testament plainly teaches that the Spirit of God now dwells in us, in believers in Jesus. As we just saw, the Bible literally says that we are that temple. Maybe this is why Jesus allowed the destruction of the physical temple in Jerusalem just a few years after his resurrection. In fact, he not only predicted that the temple would be destroyed, in John 4:21, he told the Samaritan woman, "Believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." So Jesus expressly told us that there are no longer any geographical restrictions attached to the worship of God. So rather than worshiping him at a particular physical building, he said in John 4:23, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. So, under the new covenant, we are now God's temple. God's Spirit dwells in us. And the building in Jerusalem is no longer a requirement for our worship of God. Now, notice what happens when we cross out the temple worship, since it's no longer required, right? That also impacts the old covenant commands about sacrifices and feasts. So, if a temple is no longer required, then the services that were commanded to happen at that temple are no longer required either, right? Nor is the priesthood that performed the services. So, on the issue of the temple, the question is this: are we going to follow the law of Moses, which requires a physical temple, or the gospel of Jesus, which doesn't? Because you can't require a physical temple and not require a physical temple at the same time, right? No, the Torah commands requiring a physical sanctuary have served their God-ordained purpose and are no longer required. Now, some people might argue that the apostles attended temple services in the New Testament, thereby acknowledging the ongoing validity of the temple. But just like the Levitical priesthood, the point isn't whether the temple was operational, it's whether it was required, right? Because the temple was never prohibited. So the question is whether a physical sanctuary is a requirement under the new covenant. And the answer that Jesus gave us is no, which means that we need to choose whether we're going to follow Moses or Jesus on this issue. All right, next up is the closely related issue of the temple veil. And we'll write veil in there. Now, obviously, if a physical temple is no longer required, then neither is the temple veil. But hear me out on this one, because there's an important nuance here. So, as part of those temple commands we just looked at, God provided Israel with specific instructions about the innermost chamber of the temple, which is called the most holy place. And I'll just put MHP here, most holy place. And this is where the presence of God dwelled. And Yahweh instructed the Israelites to create a beautiful curtain and hang it outside this room to separate it from the rest of the temple. Only the high priest was allowed to pass through the veil into God's presence, and then only once a year on the Day of Atonement. And then, at the moment that Jesus died on the cross, God ripped that veil apart. Right? Matthew 27:51 says, "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split." So Matthew includes the detail that it was torn from top to bottom, from God down to earth, right? Symbolizing that access to God was no longer restricted to the high priest in the temple. The temple veil had served its God-ordained purpose and was no longer required. We can now access the presence of God directly through what Hebrews 10:20 calls a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his body, so the body of Jesus. So here we have mutually exclusive avenues of access to God's presence. If we want to keep the law of Moses, we're going to need to sew the curtain back together that God tore apart. On the other hand, if we're going to follow the gospel of Jesus, we don't need a veil at all, because he has opened a new and living way for us to access God through his body that was broken for us. So the temple veil cannot be required and not required at the same time. We need to choose whether we're going to follow Moses or Jesus on this issue. All right, next up is another closely related issue of the sin sacrifices. So we'll do sin sacrifices. Okay, now, obviously, if a physical temple is no longer required, then neither are the temple sacrifices, right? But again, hear me out on this one, because this is actually the most important issue that we're going to talk about today. So as you know, the law of Moses requires continual blood sacrifices to atone for sin. They happen on a high holiday called the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. And you can read all about it and we'll write it here, Leviticus 16. So every single year, year after year, the high priest would perform the commands given in the Torah to atone for the sins of the people of Israel. And if the law of Moses is still in effect today, then those annual sacrifices must still be required, right? But if that's the case, it raises a critical question. Why did Jesus shed his blood for us on the cross? If our sin still needs to be atoned for under the Old Covenant commands, then the sacrifice of Jesus must not have been enough. However, the Bible tells us it was enough. Hebrews 10 says that those repeated animal sacrifices weren't God's final plan for atonement. Hebrews 10, 3 through 5 says, "But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins. It's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me.'" So the book of Hebrews teaches 4 separate times that Jesus was our sacrifice once for all. And notice this, Hebrews 10 verses 17 and 18 remind us that God promised that under his new covenant, their sins and lawless acts I will remember no more. And where these have been forgiven, sacrifice for sin is no longer necessary. So under the new covenant, there is no longer any offering for sin. And so we have mutually exclusive methods of atonement here. If you want to follow the Old Covenant law, then you need to keep these annual animal sacrifices that were commanded for sin. However, if you want to follow the new covenant, then Jesus was your atoning sacrifice for sin once for all. And sacrifice for sin is no longer necessary. And in that case, we can recognize that the sin sacrifices commanded in the law of Moses have served their God-ordained purpose and are no longer required. Because again, if the sin sacrifices commanded under the law of Moses are still required, then the sacrifice of Jesus wasn't really once for all. To teach that those sin sacrifices are still required today is to teach that his blood wasn't effective enough to cover all our sins. And on this point, you may come across 2 arguments from our Torah-observant friends. First, some will try to argue that the apostles attended temple services in the New Testament and must have made sin sacrifices, thereby acknowledging the ongoing validity of the Mosaic requirements. And there are 2 big problems with this argument. First, as with the priests in the temple, the point isn't whether the sin sacrifices continued to be performed. It's whether they were required. And second, there is no evidence in the Bible that any of the apostles ever participated in sin sacrifices. Now, some teachers might try to claim that in Acts 21, Paul took a Nazirite vow that included a sin sacrifice. But that's actually not the case. In fact, let's take a minute to look at that. So in Acts 21, we read about how Paul went to visit James in Jerusalem, and James says to Paul, "Hey, some people claim that you're teaching Jewish believers in Jesus not to walk according to their Jewish customs." So James says this, starting in verse 23. "So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved." And because he mentions shaving their heads, we know he's talking about a Nazirite vow. "Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law." And then skipping down to verse 26. "The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them." Okay, so James tells Paul to assist these 4 men with their Nazirite vows to show that he's not encouraging Jews to abandon their religious identity in order to follow Jesus, right? And Paul has no problem doing so. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul explains his position on this issue. In verse 20, he writes, "To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law." Paul's happy to become like one under the law for the sake of the gospel. So, back to Acts 21, what do we actually see Paul doing here in this passage? Well, look at verse 26. Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. So they all immersed themselves in a mikveh, which is a ritual bath. And then it says Paul went to the temple. And why did he go to the temple? Well, it was to give notice. To give notice of what? To give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made. So Paul doesn't make a sin offering or any other offering at the temple here. No, he tells the priests, hey, the 7 days of purification for these 4 guys will end on such and such a date, and that's when their offering will be made. And if we keep reading, the next verse, verse 27, tells us that even before their days of purification are over and any offering can be made, Paul gets arrested. It says, when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him. So, no, Acts 21 does not show Paul making sin sacrifices. The Bible nowhere says that any follower of Jesus made a sin sacrifice after his resurrection. Now, the second argument we'll hear from our Hebrew roots friends is that the Old Covenant sacrifices don't accomplish the same thing as Christ's sacrifice because they each perform different functions, right? The sacrifices commanded to atone for sin in the law of Moses never actually took away sin. They just pointed to the one who does. And therefore, the argument goes, the Old Covenant sin sacrifices actually complement rather than contradict the New Covenant sacrifice of Christ. Now, we can certainly agree that in the big picture, the Old Covenant sacrifices were never truly able to take away sins. And yet, that's what God required. Leviticus 16 says that Yahweh decreed that the blood of the animals was how the priests were to atone for sin. This was God's prescribed method of atonement under the Old Covenant. In Leviticus 17:11, God said, "For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." And then God's method of atonement changed under the new covenant because of the work of Christ. Romans 3:25 says, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. So look at that. It turns out that the Old Covenant sin sacrifices did serve the same function as the New Covenant sacrifice of Jesus. Namely, they were both sacrifices made to atone for sin. And while the Old Covenant sin sacrifices brought temporary atonement that had to be renewed every year, the sacrifice of Jesus was once for all. Hebrews 9:25 and 26 says, "Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself." Jesus did away with sin once and for all. And as we saw, the author of Hebrews goes on to say in Hebrews 10:18 that there is no longer any offering for sin. Under the new covenant, sacrifice for sin is no longer necessary. So, yes, these are mutually exclusive methods of atonement, right? The yearly annual sacrifices for sin cannot be both required and not required at the same time. We can either follow Moses and keep the repeated animal sacrifices, or we can follow Jesus, who was our atoning sacrifice for sin once and for all. Lastly, and this is a quick one, we have circumcision. So I'll add our final box here. So circumcision of all Israelite males is required in the Torah. And for a person to be ritually circumcised under the law of Moses, it included a commitment to the Sinai covenant and an obligation to keep the Mosaic law. Which is why in the early days of the Christian church, the Judaizers were teaching circumcision pretty strongly. It was a prominent identity marker for followers of the God of Israel. This is why in Galatians 2, Paul recounts how he had brought Titus, an uncircumcised Greek believer, with him to Jerusalem to meet the apostles. And the apostles didn't require Titus to be circumcised. And yet, circumcision was required under the Mosaic law. Galatians 5 reveals that things had changed dramatically under the new covenant. Verses 1 through 3 say, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law." And obviously, Paul isn't talking about circumcision as a medical procedure or a personal choice. He's specifically addressing ritual circumcision that's undertaken in an attempt to conform to the Old Covenant law. And under the New Covenant, Paul calls it a yoke of slavery that undermines the value of what Jesus did for us. He says, if you accept ritual circumcision, Christ will be of no value to you at all. The acceptance of the Mosaic rite of circumcision as a matter of obedience or righteousness does us no good. And to drive this point home, Paul writes a few verses later in Galatians 5:6, "For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love." And then once more in chapter 6, verse 15, for good measure, "Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is the new creation." So circumcision has served its God-ordained purpose and is no longer required. Now, under the new covenant, ritual circumcision is not only not required, it's frowned upon. So the question is, once again, which one are we going to follow? The law of Moses, which requires circumcision, or the gospel of Jesus, which doesn't? Because the rite of circumcision can't be required and not required at the same time. We have to choose between Moses and Jesus on this issue too. Hopefully this has been helpful for you to understand the sense in which Scripture does not leave us the option of following both Jesus and Moses. We just saw 5 reasons why trying to follow both is not only illogical, it's unbiblical. The Bible teaches that the old points us to the new. Moses pointed to Jesus, and Jesus taught that the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms all pointed to him. That's why when the resurrected Jesus gave us his great commission, he didn't say, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe the law and the prophets." No, in fact, he nowhere commands his disciples to teach the law and the prophets. Now, some Hebrew roots teachers might try to argue with that idea by pointing to Matthew 5:19. But that verse doesn't include a command to teach the law and the prophets to the nations. So what did Jesus actually say in his parting words to guide his church? He said, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." And again, Jesus nowhere commands his disciples to teach people to observe the law and the prophets. He just doesn't. Now, that said, the Torah and the entire Hebrew Bible is crucial and foundational to our understanding of who Jesus is, so it can't be dismissed or done away with, right? Even though the Old Covenant law isn't binding on Christians as a body of legal requirements of obedience, it still plays an important role in the life of a Christian. It witnesses against our sin, and it points us to Jesus, and it teaches us about the heart of God and the history of his people, and it's a source of great wisdom and insight. We have to listen to what it tells us. And what it points us to is Jesus. The Old and the New Covenants are both parts of God's sovereign plan, and they each have a vital role to play. But they're 2 separate covenants, and they can't both be in effect at the same time. There are just too many mutually exclusive commands, as we've just seen. And on top of that, Hebrews 8:13 tells us directly, by calling this covenant new, God has made the first one obsolete. Jesus didn't come to point us backward to Moses. No, Moses came and the law was given to point us forward to Jesus. Galatians 3 says, "Now before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. So then, the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian." Now that Jesus and his new covenant have arrived, we are no longer under Moses and the Old Covenant. Thanks for watching. Shalom.